By now, we know how to build components and work with multiple components, and we know how to work with state and how to handle user events. In this course section, we're now going to dive into rendering lists and rendering conditional content. So we'll have a look at how we can output arrays of data on our page and how we can show different content based on different conditions. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into in this module. We're going to continue working on the application we already started over the last course sections, but in this module, we're now going to finish it by adding these features. So here's our project, and we already got a list of data there, but of course this list is static. It's not dynamic at all at the moment. So for example, if we filter here, this does not affect the list at all. And also if we would add a new item here, you would also see that as we pick this and add this, it's not added to the list because we haven't added the logic for this yet. So therefore, that's what we're going to do. And therefore, here in this application, we now want to continue working on that. In the expenses.js file, we currently render our list of expenses by individually adding these expense item elements here in our JSX code. And that's of course not dynamic at all. In most web applications, we don't know in advance how many items we want to render. I mean, here, for example, we don't know how many expenses the user is going to add and how many expenses should be displayed when a certain year is selected. So therefore, hard coding the number of expense items as we're currently doing it is definitely not the way to go. Instead, we want to render that list dynamically. And doing that is a standard case, which you'll face in a lot of projects and applications, and it's therefore also straightforward to do with React. So here is how it does work. We want to render our expenses, which are defined in app.js. Here we got this expenses array. And we want to render this in the expenses component. Therefore, the first step is to pass our expenses down via props, which we're already doing. We are passing the items prop, which points at this expenses array. So in the expenses component, we do get our list of expenses, but we're currently not using that. And that's what we want to change. On our props, we got this items prop, and the value of that will be that array, which we in the end want to render here. But we don't want to output the array as text or anything like that. Instead, we want to render one expense item per element in the array. And that's straightforward to do. For this, we first of all need single curly braces opening and closing because we want to execute a dynamic expression in our JSX code. And you learned that that's done with curly braces. Then we can execute JavaScript expressions here. Now the expression which I do want to execute here is that I reach out to my array of data, in this case the array of expenses, and that then for every element we want to create such a JSX element. For this we can access props items, that's our array of items, our array of expenses, and now we can use a built-in array method, which is built into standard JavaScript, and that's the map method. You can learn more about this method if you Google for JS array map. And what this method does is that it creates a new array based on another array, and it basically transforms every element in that original array. So here in this example, you for example see that we have an array of numbers, and with map, we multiply every number with 2 so that we get this new array as a result. And for applying this transformation, map, this method which we can call, takes a function which we pass as an argument, and that function is then executed for every item in the array on which we're calling map. And the result of this function is the element which will be added to the newly created array. That's how this works. And that's a built-in method, as I said, and we can utilize it here to transform our array of objects, which we have here, we got a bunch of objects in there, into an array of JSX elements To be precise, into an array full of expense item JSX elements. Because if you do output an array of JSX elements here, like a couple of cards, then React is capable of simply rendering these elements. So if you had something like this, an array of JSX elements as part of your JSX code, React would simply render these elements side by side. And that's what we utilize here to transform our array of objects into such an array of expense items, which then are rendered by React. So map, as I just showed you, takes a function as an argument, and that function executes for every element in the array, and it gets that element for which it's currently executing as a parameter. So here we get our expense, for example, and then in the function body, so on the right side of this arrow, if we're using an arrow function, we then have to return the JSX element into which we want to map this expense. So in this case, I want to map every expense in my expenses array. I want to map every expense into an expense item JSX element. So I want to transform the expense object to this special kind of object, to this JSX element. And then we can just configure this as we did it here. We add a title prop, but the title is now expense.title. So this expense, which is passed as a parameter into this function, automatically, because that's how map works, that expense is used to extract the title. And we do the same for the amount with expense amount. And of course, we do the same for the date by setting the date prop to expense date. Let me reformat this. And this is now how that looks like. Now we can get rid of the hard-coded expense items here, and we're only left with this map expression here, where we transform our array to an array full of JSX items. Hence, if I now save this and I reload, we get a warning, which you can ignore for now, but we also see that we got all these items being rendered. Just as before, but now it's actually happening dynamically, which simply means that now it's based on the actual array. And that, of course, means that we can now also change that array, and such changes will be reflected in that list. And that's what we're going to do next, therefore. Of course, feel free to try it on your own first. We're going to do it together in the next lecture. So how could we now update this expenses array whenever a new expense is being added? Well, for this, we need to go to app.js because that is where we have this expenses array. There, we also have this addExpenseHandler function, which we added in the last course section, which is triggered whenever a new expense is added. And we even receive the expense as a parameter here. So all we gotta do is we have to add this expense to this expenses array. But of course, if we just add it like this, nothing would happen because you already learned that just because you change some variable, React won't update the component. Instead, to achieve that, you need to use state. And therefore here in app.js, where we manage our expenses, we now want to import use state from React so that we can register some state here. And I will actually grab this array here, this constant, and extract it out of this component function and instead store it here and name it initial expenses or dummy expenses, since that's what it is, so that this actually is just some dummy data which we can use to initialize our state with. But then inside of the app component function, we call use state, and I'll pass my dummy expenses, so this array full of dummy data, as an initial state value, so that we have some initial expenses to display. But then here we can again use destructuring, as I showed it to you in the last section, to get access to our expenses and to the setExpenses state updating function. And now that we got this here in the addExpenseHandler, where we want to add a new expense, we can call setExpenses to set our expenses array to a new array which includes this new expense. So how should we update this? Well, we could pass a new array here, and then let's say we want to add the new expense as the first item in the array. For that, we could add the expense, which we're getting here, as an item to this array, and then use the spread operator on the existing expenses to pull out all the existing array elements and populate the rest of this new array with those existing elements. We can use the spread operator not just on objects, but also on arrays. And again, that's not a React feature, that's a standard JavaScript feature. However, if we would update the state like this, it would not really be correct, as you learned in the last course section. Instead, if you update your state depending on the previous state or the previous snapshot of this state, you should use this special function form for this state updating function, so that we pass a function as an argument to this state updating function, and that function will automatically receive the latest state snapshot. So here we would then get our previous expenses automatically by React, and we would return our new array where we add this expense, which we're getting as a parameter here, and where we then add our previous expenses with that spread operator. And that's the clean way of updating our state when it's based on an older snapshot of that same state. Now with that, we add our new expense, and now since we're using our expenses state here to pass it to expenses, we should automatically have a dynamic list which automatically updates when items are added. So if we now add a book for 29.99 and pick some date here, we see that being added here as a first item. So this is working, and now this is a truly dynamic list by using state and by outputting these items with this map method. And that's how you output lists of data dynamically with React. Now let's have a look at this key warning and what that is all about. So why are we getting this key warning? After all, it looks like everything works. Well, React has a special concept when it comes to rendering lists of data, a concept which exists to ensure that React is able to update and render such lists efficiently without performance losses or bugs which may occur. And I want to show you which problem we have with the current implementation. If you have a look at your developer tools and you go to the Elements tab there, you can inspect your list here, which is this list of divs. We could change this to a list with list items, but for the moment I'll stick to these divs here. And if we now have a look at this list here, then you should watch the part here on the right in the developer tools as I add a new item. A book 2, for example, for $39.99. If I add that, watch these divs on the right. Did you see what happened? This last item flashed. And if an item flashes here, it means that it was edited or added by the browser. Now it's strange that the last item flashed, because actually the new item was added as the first item, the topmost item in this list. To understand what's going on, let me expand this first item, a book 2 which I just added, and let me add a third item here. Like this. Let's add this and click Add Expense. And you see, this also flashed. If not, rewind and go back a couple of seconds, and you'll see that this H2 tag of the first item also flashed when I added this new item. So what actually happens here when I add a new item is that React renders this new item as the last item in this list of divs and updates all items and replaces their content such that it again matches the order of the items in my array. And this is not great. This is happening because to React, all these items look similar, and it only sees that my array changed, that it's now longer than before, And hence it simply renders an additional div and it adds that at the end. And then it simply walks through all the items and updates the content inside of every item to match the array content again. The final result, therefore, is correct here, but from a performance perspective, this is not great because all items are visited and updated, and it can even lead to bugs. If the expense items would be stateful items, and we would have some state managed inside of that, then if, for example, our first item, if it has a certain state, if we add a new item, the old first item would be overwritten with the new first item. Hence, any state changes we might have had in there would be lost. So besides potential performance issues, we could also run into bugs. So that is a problem. And the question therefore is, why does React behave like this? The answer is because it has no other way. It currently simply checks the length of the array and then has a look at the number of items that were already rendered. The individual items all look similar to React though, so it can't know where a new item should be added or anything like that. That's why we get this warning, because we have a way of telling React where a new item should be added. And we do that by going to the place where we output our list of items, so this map method here, and we then add a special prop to this item here. And that's the key prop. This is not a prop we are using inside of expense item, but instead it's a prop you can add to any component, no matter if it's a custom component by you or if it's a built-in HTML element. You can always add this. And if you do add it, if you add the key to your component or HTML element, then you can help React identify the individual items. For that, you need to set a unique value per list item. And that, for example, in this case here, would be the expense ID. Because in our expenses array, every item has a unique ID. And if you wonder what you do if you have no unique ID, then you could use the second argument, which you get here for the function you pass to map, which is an automatically managed index. Though it's discouraged to use that, since with that you can still run into bugs because the index for a given item is always the same and not directly attached to the content of the item. For the ID that's different, every item with a certain content has a clear unique ID. And in reality, it turns out that in most scenarios, you do have some unique ID, because typically you are rendering some data which comes from a database or anything like that, and there you work with unique IDs anyways. So finding some unique identifier is no problem. And you can use any primitive value as a unique identifier. Any number or string, that can be unique identifiers. So here I add this key pointing at expense ID. And once we do that, if we reload, we no longer get that warning. And if I now inspect my list here again, and I inspect the title of the currently first item, if I now add a new item again, like this book, you will see that this h2 tag did now not flash. Instead, this div flashed, and this div was also now added at the beginning of the list correctly, this div here, I mean, as it should be. Because now React is able to uniquely identify all these items, and it's therefore aware not just how long the array is, but also where which item should be placed, and it's able to update this list in a more efficient way. So long story short, you should always add such a key when mapping out lists of items. And I hope I could explain why that matters. You don't need to know why, it's enough if you add it, but I think it's always important that you also do understand what's going on behind the scenes and why you're doing something. So our filter is now working, but we can actually select values where we have no data. And we might want to show an appropriate message in such cases. And that leads us to the second part of this module, conditional content, which is also important. Conditional content is about rendering different output under different conditions. So I'm not talking about lists, but about rendering either A or B or C, whatever you need. And that's something I want to do here. In expenses.js, we render our list of expense items. But if our filtered expenses array turns out to be empty, we render nothing. Now, we might want to instead render a message telling the user that we have no items for the chosen filter. And for that, we want to render content conditionally. How can we do that? Well, we can again add a dynamic expression here in our JSX code and simply use a condition here. I'm not talking about an if condition because long statements like this, the same is true for loops, are actually not allowed here between these curly braces, but we can use a ternary expression here. And we could check if our filtered expenses length is equal to 0, which means we have no items in that filtered expenses array. And if that's the case, after a question mark, which is the default JavaScript ternary expression syntax, we render a simple message in a paragraph where we say, no expenses found. Otherwise, after the colon, we render our list. So we grab this here, cut it, and remove this empty pair of curly braces now, and we render this mapping expression in the else case. And again, that's the default JavaScript ternary expression syntax. Condition, question mark, then what we want to do if the condition is met, colon, for the else case, what we want to do if it's not met. And if we save this, you see, I got no expenses found here for 2022, but for 2020, I do have my expense. Now, of course, that's a bit hard to read. We can fine-tune this in a second, but that's how we can render content conditionally. Of course, long ternary expressions like this can be a bit hard to read though. So we can also fine-tune this or restructure this and reuse this condition, but then abuse a little trick in JavaScript. We can add the AND operator and then use the content, the JSX content we want to render if this condition is met. JavaScript works such that if you use the AND operator, it basically will return the part after the AND operator as a result of this overall check here if the first condition is met. So if this first condition is met, it moves on to the part after the AND operator and it then returns that value. And that's what we're abusing here. And abusing sounds like a bad thing. This is actually something which is fine to use. You'll see it in a lot of React projects, and it simply allows you to write shorter expressions. Because now we can do the same here for our alternative. There we want to check if we got more than 0 items, and then we use and to output our list here. So now I basically split that long ternary expression into 2 standalone expressions which check different conditions, using this AND trick here, where the part after AND is rendered if the part before AND returns true. And with that, we got the same behavior as before, as you can tell. But even that might be too much logic in the JSX code, so we also got a totally alternative way of handling this. We can add a variable, maybe name it expenses content, but the name is up to you. And we assign a default value here. And the default value could be our message that no content was found. And we can store JSX content like this in variables. We can return it, and we can also use it anywhere else where we work with values. So we can store JSX content in variables, as I'm doing it here. This is absolutely fine. You are not limited to using JSX only if you return. You can also use it to create a value which is stored in a variable. Now, why am I doing that though? Because now we can add an if check here before we return, and we can check if filtered expenses length is greater than 0. So if we do have filtered expenses. And if that's the case, I want to override expenses content. So I will change the value of this variable. And I will set this then to the result of this map call here, like this. So this list of expense items. That's my value stored in expenses content if we got a length greater than 0. And then down there in our returned JSX code, we can get rid of all that logic and we just add a simple dynamic expression where we point at expenses content, so at this variable. And this variable holds either this JSX code or this array of JSX elements. Both is renderable and therefore both can be used here. And now we get a lean JSX snippet which we return, and we get our logic in the component function itself. And we could argue that this is more readable. And again, if we save that, it works just as before. And it's up to you which approach you prefer. It also depends on the length of the conditions and the content which is rendered under different cases. But ultimately, this is probably the cleanest way. But again, it is up to you what you prefer. I want to show you all options so that you can go with the way which you personally like the most. I will go with this approach because I'm a fan of having a lean JSX snippet here.